sectors and that promote gender equality in their countries, in their communities, at all different levels, and that also empower other women and themselves. These women remind us that it is possible to think of of a world that can be more sustainable, more equitable, and more just and inclusive. Just like the previous events, today's interview will be led by our gender and environment champion and our resident representative of UNDP in Costa Rica, Mr. Jose Vicente Troya Rodriguez. But these mornings wouldn't be a reality without the support of the UNDP office in Costa Rica and our gender champion, of course, and all our colleagues, Rafaela, Ingrid, Tatiana, Diana, as well as the support from our colleagues of the Regional Center of UNDP, Patricia, Carolina. Without them and without all these transforming women, Latin American transforming women today, and all these coffee mornings wouldn't be a reality. Today, we are here today with one of our colleague, activist, feminist, and leader, Hortencia Hidalgo. Hortencia has shown us that it's possible to promote and to defend the fundamental rights of indigenous communities at all different levels and in all different platforms. We have seen her run on the hallways of the climate change hallways and diversity until the classrooms of universities and until today as the coordinator of the indigenous department of FILAC. Hortencia, also with the help of other transforming women of the Red de Mujeres Indígenas, have transformed their communities and they leave a footprint, and they are and have been the voices and the speakers of indigenous women of our region whose reality and needs and contributions have been ignored. That's why from the gender area or sector of UNDP in Latin America, as well as myself personally, it is a great honor to be able to have her here with her knowledge, her wisdom, her experience, and her voice in this Green and Violet morning. Without any further ado, I would like to give the word to our gender champion, Mr. Jose Vicente Troya. Good morning. Thank you very much, Andrea. What a pleasure to be able to say hello to all of you. Welcome to this virtual Green and Violet morning, the voices of the Latin American women that protect and transform our environment. Right now, I am honored to introduce you to our guest of honor to this third coffee event. She is an emblematic woman and a tireless leader within our region, Ms. Hortencia Hidalgo. She is the coordinator of the Indigenous Women's Unit of the Development Fund for Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, FILAC. You are very welcome here, dear Hortencia. How are you all, brothers, sisters? It is a great pleasure to say hello and to thank you for the opportunity in this beautiful moment, in this beautiful program where I have the privilege of participating and where many other great women have been here and women who I admire. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hortensia. It's really a true honor to have you here today in the virtual times right now. It is hard to even tell the time of day because it's virtual. We recognize in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are unique women who are agents of change and who lead pioneering efforts in various environmental issues and at the same time promote gender equality and women's empowerment across diverse ecosystems. Therefore, from UNDP, we have created this space called Green and Violet Virtual Coffee Times in order to highlight your voices, to listen to your vast experiences, and to identify priority actions in the region in order to promote a social and environmental transformation that recognizes the contributions of women in all their diversity and that can promote your autonomy. I would like to open with the reflection highlighting a fundamental premise of the Latin American ecofeminisms. The link between women, land, and nature positions us as humanity in the urgency of embracing an ethical perspective that guides our struggle against the devastation of natural resources. This is a philosophy and a praxis that should be based and is based on the universalization of care, on a more horizontal and more pluralistic view, and that powerfully promotes deep understanding and intrinsic understanding of women, especially women of indigenous peoples who are the repositories of historical and ancestral knowledge that allow us to understand how to better care for our planet, which in the face of this triple crisis, that is the type of information and ethics and knowledge that are urgent for humanity and the planet. So once again, you are very welcome here, dear Hortensia. To begin this conversation, I would first like to hear from you. How did you begin your leadership on the issue of Indigenous peoples' rights? What role does the Red de Mujeres Indígenas sobre Biodiversidad play in promoting these issues? Well, I began very young in this process, first defending human rights. And the environmental aspect is a human right. So since I was very young in the university processes where you begin, asking about identities of youth to strengthen their identities when you are growing up, these cultural shocks become very big or very large. First, strengthening identity. And throughout that process, we started realizing that in our region, there were a lot of issues and problems. I'm from the northern area of Chile, a place that has a lot of needs for water. It is a place that does not have a lot of water. And at that time, some companies wanted to exploit and take advantage of the indigenous communities. And our first defense to start with and to start my journey in this environmental aspect was the rights of water. And that's where I began my process. There was a need also to communicate to the rest of the country that this northern area of China, these things or issues that we were living through in the border, because the Aymara nation is a nation that is now divided between Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. So for the rest of Chile, the Aymaras that were living in that border did not exist. Actually, when we go to the capital, they ask us if we are Peruvians or Bolivians. And we back then started a process so that the country could start learning in this such a long country for people to start understanding what were the needs of the population of the northern part of the border of the country and the problems and issues that we were going through. So that was like our first struggle in environmental aspects. And that's where I started becoming a leader. And then from being a young person, I started assuming other roles, for example, in the Maimara Council. And now we started with environmental topics, but also trying to impact politically for a constitutional recognition with the ratification of the agreement number 169. We started working to get to the Congress and trying to make congressmen understand and learn and educate people. And this strip, very long country, we began with the partnership with different indigenous communities so that we could start understanding these topics. But that was my start. My life was, you know, absorbed by the territory that I was there and those invisible voices, which are the indigenous women, because also the women were the ones that were leading the voices. And that's why many women have been involved in this process. I appreciate and thank the process or the journey that other Indigenous women have taken, and they are not here now. And I am who I am thanks to many women who have contributed to my growth because of their own experience. As I asked, the role that the indigenous women, La Red de Mujeres Indígenas did on my life, of course, has been a great role because from a process that was so local in a region that was so invisible, centralism does not recognize that. In a small town, in a very small population, those needs and those environmental needs specifically, those clashes to those and struggles and issues of human rights become a national issue and then an international issue. So you start growing bit by bit and taking those different spheres of those contributions. Like our colleague said, how many times have we not met with you in institutions like UNDP for that struggle for environmental issues, for the rights of our Mother Earth? So our colleagues from REMIP have played a fundamental role. Maybe people know this, that thanks to men and women that have done and played those great foundations in UNDP, now we have international instruments that guarantee the protection of the indigenous peoples and that guarantee the participation of indigenous women. For example, in the Convenio de Diversidad Biológica, how from the indigenous communities on biodiversity, how indigenous communities were able to participate. And it's a protocol that many peoples are using today. So those are like the contributions that we try to make from the small scale up to the largest scale. How now today we have some instruments. So the Protocolo de Nagoya is our son. We had to struggle on it, we had to negotiate it, and now they guarantee rights. That instrument and many other instruments that are colleagues older than us, female colleagues, for example, Declaration of the United Nations on the communities of the indigenous peoples is like the mother of this. Also the participation of men and women, indigenous people that were negotiating for over 20 years so that we today who are in this process already have a framework that protects our rights as indigenous people and
Gracias, Hortensia, por
indigenous
compartirnos
communities. Thank you,
esa
Hortensia, for
trayectoria de
sharing
vida, ese
that
itinerario geográfico
life
en la historia
trajectory
que nos da cuenta de la intensidad
that
de una lucha colectiva,
makes us
como bien lo
realize
señalas.
this struggle and this
Pero
collective
quisiéramos
struggle and
preguntarte,
fight,
¿de qué
as
forma
you mentioned. We would like to
empoderadamente
also ask you,
los
in what
movimientos
ways does
feministas
empowering
en la historia
Indigenous
de
women
América Latina
promotes the protection of
podrías, por favor,
biodiversity?
compartirnos
Could you please
algunos
provide
ejemplos
some
o
examples
comentar
or
sobre algún
comment on a
tiempo o
particular
caso en
case
particular?
study?
Comentar el gran
Yes,
trabajo.
I would like to comment the great work. And so just a few, there are many, many examples and many case studies and many experiences that are beautiful. And I'm going to comment, for example, our male and female colleagues of RITA, which is the International Network of Tourism. And these are community protocols. They developed through the participation, the full and effective participation of Indigenous women, of youth, and the elderly, these community protocols that are there to govern the previous and informed consent. So the Protocol of Nagoya says that, how that becomes a law. So from the self-determination, how those women can be able to determine and write what their process will be like, how they will be given to give permission or not to companies, to pharmaceutical companies. So that's very important. How women can become empowered within a process that they can later on go ahead and design their community protocols. And those community protocols, they write about fair and equitable distribution. Of course, there needs to be an agreement and it needs to be approved, but it says that women, indigenous women, can be part of that process to participate of fair and equitable distribution. But mainly, women, indigenous women, we are the guardians and we have those ancestral knowledge and wisdom. So how those indigenous women of those communities need to be consulted. So there needs to be a full previous informed consent. And that is an example that I can say how you can have an international instrument and you can make it a community protocol where those women are benefited, where women can make decisions. And another example that I would like to give you is from the Aymara culture, the Andean culture, the fact that you can strengthen your identity or strengthen your indigenous knowledge is so important in the role that indigenous women play today. For example, in this climate crisis that we already face today, indigenous knowledge come now and become a response to this climate crisis. First, as you mentioned, Jose, in this relationship that the indigenous peoples have with Mother Earth, with the Pachamama, is very different. This this holistic, comprehensive relationship of respect to Mother Earth, and we have indigenous knowledge and wisdom that can mitigate those effects of climate change, our indigenous knowledge. And indigenous women are the ones that hold that knowledge. I always mention, and everybody says that I'm a fan of potatoes. So we Andean eat a lot of potatoes. We sow and harvest many types of potatoes, and we protect all sorts of potatoes. And we have indigenous technology, millenary knowledge that we keep in our refrigerators. And what are our refrigerators? It is the earth, below the earth. Those are our refrigerators. Our potatoes can last for months, but when we dehydrate our potatoes, we have what we call papachup, which can last 20 years. 20 years. We dehydrate those potatoes, we give them treatment, and in those, so these are indigenous knowledge, but it's indigenous technology. So in a season where there are droughts, where we don't have water to sow or harvest, like right now, where we have these water wells that are dry right now because there's no water, we still have food. We have food to feed an entire population because we have those potatoes from different years that we have collected. And if there's frost as well. So a specific example is that through our indigenous knowledge, we have solutions for climate crisis. And that's not only something that we say by indigenous communities, also the IPCC, who are the experts in environmental issues, in their reports, they have highlighted that the knowledge of indigenous peoples and the rights of the indigenous peoples are fundamental for this climate crisis. So just like these, I can give you so many more examples, but I think that these can describe the importance of women in this relationship with
Muchas
Mother Earth.
gracias, Hortensia. Me
Thank
quedé
you very
pensando
much,
que tú ya
Hortencia.
destacaste cuál es la
I
importancia
started
de
thinking that you're already
reconocer y
highlighting the
reconocer
importance of promoting
estos
the
antepasados
recognition
o
or recognizing
ancestrales
the
conocimientos
ancestral
tradicionales
wisdom
que de alguna
and
manera están ya
knowledge
siendo reconocidos
that are
pero
somehow being recognized
surge esta
already.
inquietud
But
de
I
cuál
have
es el
the
trecho
question
que tenemos
of
que correr
what
y si
is
se puede
that,
más
eh,
el
you
reconocimiento de
know,
estos saberes y de estas
how what
tecnologías
ways do we
en
still
un
have to
tiempo en el que
progress to
hablamos
continue recognizing
de
these
tiempo, ¿no?
knowledge and wisdoms and technologies that can allow us even to figure out how to deal with time? So potatoes that can be conserved for 20 years and be able to be used again,
genera
that's
mucha
truly something
curiosidad.
that creates a lot of interest and curiosity. Well, the gap is still very large. And I speak about this with a lot of excitement because it's what we live with and comes to mind. But undoubtedly, the Latin American gap is very large. First, what is missing? What is it that we don't have? And there's many countries that still do not have constitutional recognition for indigenous peoples. There are, and that is important. What is important today? A full and effective participation to open up the spaces for indigenous women and indigenous peoples to be able to also participate. There are national tables of climate change. There are national tables of biodiversity. In many countries, there are very good practices. For example, Costa Rica has a national table where the indigenous communities participate and they take decisions. jointly. But there are countries where the indigenous peoples are not even called or summoned for consultations, and that is important. So the different states need to first open up those spaces because indigenous peoples have those types of knowledge. And I think that today we have made a little bit progress in the political participation of indigenous women. And I want to mention the case of Chile with great happiness because we are working on this very important process, political process, where the president is, so it's a country with a lot of issues. So and they always tell me it's symbolic, and I say no, it's not symbolic. It's political. It's political. And today, indigenous women, we have to participate in politics. We need to make decisions. They don't need to call us only to for consultation, but we need to also lead those public policies. And in that, I do think there is a political participation gap between indigenous women and men, where we indigenous women are a minimum percentage. I would like to tell you that today I'm part of FILAC, which is the Fondo para el Desarrollo de los Pueblos Indígenas de Latinoamérica y el Caribe. FILAC is an international entity of public law that was born in 1992 in the so the the indigenous peoples promote the fact that there needs to be an opportunity or a space that can promote and support indigenous peoples. And from there, there are different unities. I am in the indigenous women's unit. And from there, we are trying to promote everything around political participation of women and decision making, especially in everything around the aspects that affect us around the different types of violence that women suffer. And from there, I would like to talk to you about an initiative that we are undertaking today, which is a project called Tejiendo Redes. They benefit different women in Latin America. So it's how a small project or fund changes. And first, for women to have autonomy, because in order to have political autonomy, you need to have economic autonomy. And how is it that women from small initiatives are trying to do that? First, to leave the types to move away from violence because we are victims of violence. And also these indigenous knowledge that I mentioned is how to strengthen them, how to promote them, how to rescue them, and to be able to exchange those with other women. And today, for example, on Monday, next Monday, we have the launching of our leadership and strengthening course for indigenous women. This diplomado is there to strengthen environmental issues, human rights, indigenous human rights. So it's to strengthen and encourage 40 indigenous women. And these are different promotions that we already have. So you realize how proud people will say this woman who was part of our course of leadership is now a congresswoman. So now she's making decisions. So the way we are trying to promote and encourage with our grain of sand in order to strengthen leadership. Also, we're composed of MILAC. MILAC are the regional organizations of indigenous women. So together and jointly with all these regional organizations of uh, indigenous women, we make the decisions to strengthen the different processes that indigenous women lead.
Gracias, Hortencia. Qué
Thank you,
interesante
Hortensia.
conocer cómo
Hortensia, how interesting it is to learn how
diferencias
you are getting
entre las
organized
diferentes
and
comunidades
overcoming all those gaps in the financial
Estados Unidos. Es
aspects,
realmente
political
bonito
participation,
saber
knowledge.
cómo
So it's
las
really
personas
encouraging, and
aprendan
it's
a identificar
great to see
los
that you're
beneficios
trying to put down
de
all
los
those
diferentes tipos de
barriers that
redes
are so
que
monumental. Some of them are
permiten
so big that can
un gran
truly
ejercicio de
impact a true
de esas diferentes
exercise of all those
actividades para
leadership
poder equilibrar
exercises, which are
en estas épocas de
core
pandemia y
for
sobre
a
todo en
recovery in
estos
these times of
tiempos.
pandemic. And on
¿Cómo
that, I
se ha
wanted to
visto la
ask you,
pandemia
how
en
has the
estos épocas
COVID-19 pandemic
y a los territorios
affecting indigenous women
ya que
and
están ahí
the
en
territories
los
and the
ecosistemas?
life spaces where the natural resources are?
Wow, qué difícil pregunta, porque la gente
Wow, what a hard
se
question, because,
te
the figures aren't so encouraging in this aspect. So from the FILEC, we are on the fourth report of indigenous peoples and COVID, and the last report has to do with vaccination rates. Our research in the access to which countries and what communities and what have vaccination. I would like to invite you to go to the web pages of FILEC on social networks, and there you can find this out. First, to start from the premise that the countries do not have statistics nor information around the variant, if it's indigenous peoples or indigenous women. So that's one thing that the states can truly have that information. And the research that we did by FILAC and by the Indigenous Women Organization, we had to do some ant work in order to rescue some information in that. And our report, unfortunately, shows that the losses and deaths that we have had, but it also showed us the good practices that the indigenous communities have when facing COVID. I would like to tell you that in my personal case, in Chile, we unfortunately had many deaths. So the public policies aimed to protect the indigenous communities came in very late. And on the other hand, there are very good practices like the delivery or the vaccination, where in Chile, we're already getting the booster shot, the third dose. So here in Bolivia, for example, the our elderly of the farthest away communities were the first ones to get their vaccines. Unfortunately, there are other cases like in Brazil where many indigenous peoples have died, or for example, in Venezuela, the Guarao peoples as well. So, what does COVID have shown us? The great inequalities and the enormous gaps that we have in the indigenous communities with the rest of the population. First, they would tell us to wash our hands. And what did we realize? That we didn't have enough water to wash our hands. In many places, in many indigenous places, there isn't drinking water to wash our hands. Second, that when the indigenous communities took the determination of closing their territories so that people from the city wouldn't come in because they could infect them, what happened there? Public policies would tell us that we weren't able to do that. So, unfortunately, and indigenous women, aside from being the guardians and protectors the of nature, they have that role in their homes as well. And in that, they have had to see other issues that have to do with technology and communication. So when the children, boys and girls, indigenous boys and girls, had to stop their studies, they weren't able to continue doing that online because internet does not reach communities because we didn't have communication. And that would be the only way of continuing to study in some cases. So those gaps today we can say are greater and larger. And just now the world has seen that there are indigenous communities that live in those conditions where they don't have electricity nor drinking water. But there's also the positive side because not everything has been negative. It has been negative because we have lost many lives and we have lost great women leaders. Unfortunately, we continue losing them still. But what are the good practices in this? First, that the non Indigenous society can appreciate and realize how the Indigenous knowledge through our medicinal plants can strengthen the organism and the body and strengthen the immune system. And in that, for the first few months, people were going crazy trying to get our natural medicines, our plants, in order to treat COVID. Second, indigenous peoples are the ones that produce food, and they produce food in a healthy way, in a natural way, based on, like I said, based on indigenous technologies. So during this pandemic that we are going through, where companies shut down, where people did not have work, a lot of people didn't have food on the tables because they couldn't work, the indigenous peoples were very had a lot of solidarity because they were able to share their foods one with another. So those that did fishing and those that did agriculture would exchange. And look what a great practice, because that's what indigenous communities are. We have a lot of solidarity, and even women were very supportive. So to share our medicines and our food. And in some places, they did respect free determination. So there were some infections going on and some contagion, and some communities decided not to move out of their communities to the health centers in the city or to clinics, and they stayed in the communities, only helping people and taking care of them with indigenous medicine and with our, indigenous doctors, she says. So that way we were able to heal a lot of people, and we demonstrated that our medicine is effective, that our medicine that many times is not appreciated is efficient, that our wise indigenous people, chamanes, cojiris, whatever we want to call them, do have the traditional knowledge to save lives, and that we are not selfish in this. So that with that, we also share our traditional knowledge with everybody else. So the pandemic, and also on the other hand, I would like to also comment how we indigenous women face it. First, women in general, and then indigenous women. So violence against women has increased in the 300%. Also, and femicide increased because you had to be enclosed during the pandemic, and many times you were enclosed with your aggressor. And that's not only in the urban areas, but also in rural areas. So those situations have been very prevalent. So those cases of violence during the pandemic. So this pandemic brings out a lot of pain this year because we have lost a lot of indigenous leaders and female leaders as well. And on the other hand, we also need to consider that these aspects that are indigenous knowledge can also save lives.
Muchas gracias, Hortensia.
Thank you very much, Hortencia.
Nos estabas comentando, claro,
You
las
were
atrocidades
mentioning, of
que se pueden
course,
sufrir
the different
por la
challenges that you can
pandemia
go through and
y
how the
sobre todo
pandemic has
la
been able to
desigualdad
reveal
y la
the
vulnerabilidad de las
inequalities and the
mujeres
vulnerabilities
que se encuentran
of
los pueblos indígenas, las mujeres indígenas,
the
¿qué otros
indigenous
desafíos
people.
encuentras tú
What other
para ayudar a las
challenges
mujeres
do you
indígenas
find for
en este
indigenous
periodo de
women
pandemia?
in terms of gender and environment? First of all, as I mentioned before, in some communities, there is still this inequality between indigenous men and women, and many times seen from within the aspect of folklore. For example, the Andean women, we live what is called dualidad, chachagualmi, or others call it complementarity. And it's true, from duality, we have ceremonies and other things, but when that is disguised from that patriarchal machismo that the Occidental societies have, so we many times try to justify those things through culture to disguise that violence, and I think that that can't be disguised anymore. We are going through a different process. Indigenous women have said it before. There are some places that, for example, incest is allowed, justified by culture, and those practices are not allowed anymore, or getting married in like elderly men with very young girls. So those are types of violence that are still marked. But of course, every day, more and more Indigenous women are complaining more. They are articulating and with other women, and that's very important. Articulation with other women is very important because it can also help throughout these processes. And the first thing that I would like to mention are the types of violence. And it's not only sexual and physical violence. Unfortunately, we have institutional violence that comes from states, mainly those guardian women, protectors, and defenders of territories. They are being killed in Latin America. In Latin America, they are killing women that are defending their territories. Many times they say that they committed suicide. And that reality, for example, that not many times has the voices to complain and demand So women in Colombia, women in Guatemala, in Chile, who have defended their territories and are not there anymore. That is institutional violence. That is the violence that many people live through day after day. First, because there are no public policies that guarantee the rights of indigenous peoples or that can guarantee protection. And those are the different types of violence that we women suffer. Second, what I mentioned before. Nowadays, the scenario, although it's different and a little bit more encouraging, is the political participation of indigenous women. And these spaces need to open up. Nothing of what we have today has been just given or handed out to us. It has been a struggle, a fight for many years. And many women are not here anymore in order to be able to achieve those spaces, those local, national, and international spaces. They were fought hardly, very hard by other women. And they're not there, maybe because they were killed, maybe because COVID, you know, they died because of COVID, or maybe because they are in another process. So those gaps are also important. That gap of being able to participate and act in decision-making processes. So today in the morning, a colleague from Colombia was mentioning that there's going to be a Guaju candidate in Colombia for the presidential elections, and how important that is, that indigenous women can also be able to become presidents, to be able to lead a constitution like is done, a constitutional process like in Chile, to decide the future of an entire nation. That fear of politics, we need to lose that, because for many years they told us that politics were bad, that indigenous peoples did not have any place in that. But we have demonstrated, and we continue demonstrating, that a great woman governing today. And so these women that are in different places of the country, I'm so proud of that. And we need to find support in that, and we need to find support in other women as well. And another gap is education. So communication and education is still a very significant gap that we need to overcome, and possibilities. And although today there are more women that have access to education, but there's still a lot of inequality between men and women, and especially between indigenous men and women. Therefore, we need to change that. We need to change that. And that's how we've been approaching that in every country. But here, the people that make the decisions need to take that into consideration, that those inequalities in terms of education and communication, like I mentioned before, COVID came to reveal and demonstrate these situations. And the most important thing, I believe, that within the different Dabdedala is to respect and encourage the rights of indigenous people, the right of free determination, like the Declaration of the Indigenous Peoples of the United Nations, that indigenous people can make their own decisions, that indigenous women can make their own decisions. That needs to be respected. So free determination needs to be respected. So all these rights, they need to be recognized in every state. And that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. But we have made progress little by little, day after day, in that recognition, in that structure. And of course, the protection of our territories, the protection of our territories in terms of biodiversity, in terms of the free, previous, informed consent, that needs to be respected. And not the pseudo consultation, because they fill us up with consultations so that we don't participate. But that's not like that. It has to do with previous, prior prior informed consent. We, indigenous women, are always going to defend our territories, even if we have to give our lives for that. And like we have seen with a lot of women, political prosecution and prosecution from the intelligence services that every state has had, and we have lived through this. With the strength given to us by Mother Earth, we have been able to overcome that. We didn't, stay under that persecution. Many colleagues at the Latin American level have gone or have experimented horrible processes, going to jail, having been beaten, and with all these new concepts. And what we analyze now is also the political violence that women that are in decision making positions are there because they're women, but especially because they are indigenous women. So that's one thing. And I think that the most relevant point here is that every state needs to have data. Data is important in order to execute or implement political policies. So it is important to have relevant indicators for indigenous women, for youth, indigenous women and communities.
Nuevamente, muchas gracias, Hortensia.
Again, thank you very much,
Se me quedan
Hortencia.
algunas
I
preguntas
tell
del
me that
público,
we
por
have
favor.
some questions from
Si por favor
the
nos
participants.
podrías
So if you could
compartir
please share
experiencias
some
prometedoras reales de
experiences, some
gobierno
promising
en términos de
and current
empoderamiento económico y
experiences in
social
terms
de
of
las mujeres
economic
indígenas.
empowerment of indigenous women.
Sí, mira, yo te quiero mencionar, por ejemplo, el
Yes, I
caso,
would like to mention the
bueno, voy a ser
case
un poco referente,
where I'm going to
las
refer to
mujeres
Chile,
cahuascas.
the
Los
Cahuajas,
cahuascar es un pueblo que es
Cahuascar
distinto,
people.
¿no? Los
It's like a
mataron
different
muchísimo,
people. They were
es una
killed a
pequeña
lot.
población. Y hoy
So the
día,
population
gracias
is
a un
very
proyecto
small.
Tejiendo
And
Redes,
today, thanks to
a
a
través
project
de
called Tejiendo
eso,
Redes, they do several things.
rescatan
One,
cómo van tejiendo
they
las
rescue the
mujeres
way
tejían sus vestidos,
how they used to
invierten en todo lo que es su proceso de
they used to
conocimiento de industria,
weave
entregando sus
their
artesanías a través de estos tejidos.
their
Eso los
boats
diferentes tejidos
and
hacen
their
una
different
canasta
their
y en ese
baskets.
empoderamiento
And so
económico
without
y
economic empowerment
precisamente
of
ellos
weaving their
protegían la industria,
baskets, not only do they
sino que
have
rescatan
economic
es un
autonomy,
pueblo
but
casi
they
extinto.
rescue
Mira
a
que
lot of knowledge
es
and wisdom
cuando un
from
estado
a
ha casi
from
eliminado
an
incluso
almost
como
extinct
el país
community, because when a state has
comercial
almost
de Chile,
extinguished
acercar
a
esos conocimientos
community,
bíblicos.
how women try to rescue
Algunas comunidades
those
con el
knowledge and
fuerte
wisdom.
rechazo
There are other
del
communities, and I know a lot of them, for
en
example,
Brasil,
in Colombia,
en Chile,
Brazil,
que a través de los
and
conocimientos
Chile,
indígenas
where
tienen
through the
empiezan a
indigenous
plantar
knowledge, and I would
maíz.
like to explain here.
Esta
I have a
plantita
little plant here. This
tiene,
plant,
esta plantita no solo
this
tiene,
plant
es un recurso biológico.
is a biological
Muchas
resource.
veces las leyes nos quieren
Not only
separar
that, many times
del recurso
politics
biológico
want
de los
to
conocimientos
separate the
indígenas.
biological resource
Entonces, esta
from
plantita nos
indigenous
puede
knowledge.
aportar
This plant
solamente unos
can give
medicamentos,
us not only
pero
medicinal
como lo
properties,
dice el
but
convenio
just
de la
like
diversidad
the
biológica, los
biodiversity
derechos
agreement
derivados,
gives
por
us,
ejemplo, hoy día
is
son
also
muchos en las zonas
derivatives.
indígenas.
And those derivatives are also a
En lo que es
boom in indigenous
cosmética,
communities.
por
So
ejemplo, de esta
in
plantita no solamente
indigenous
sacan
cosmetics, for example, from this little plant,
recurso biológico
they are getting
para una enfermedad,
biological resources not
sino
only
que
to treat
están sacando los
diseases,
derivados
but
de
they're
esta
also
planta,
getting the derivatives of that plant to make
champú,
creams,
bálsamos,
shampoos,
protectores
body
solares y un
lotions,
sinfín de cosas
skin protectors, and many other products. So first, starting from indigenous knowledge and wisdom. Second, using very natural products that we call them indigenous cosmetics. And that, honestly, there are many, startups, indigenous startups, and it becomes something very beautiful, a very beautiful product. So it has a label, well, made, and this tag, you can print it in the printer and you put it on the package, for example. So there are many projects project of there for indigenous cosmetics. Other projects that we have had are also the bees play a fundamental role in biodiversity, and there are indigenous communities that have all the protection in natural bees and in all the products that they make from honey and all the derivatives of honey as well. So also shampoos and soaps and everything related to medications. So those are that's in Mexico, Brazil, Chile, even in Bolivia. Here there are many natural products that are made and manufactured by indigenous women, and that in the plazas or the central parks, they start selling their products, and they are even selling through the internet, and they explain how they get or extract the properties from a plant and how they certify that this is a truly environmentally friendly product, and that's very important.
Gracias nuevamente.
Thank
Qué bueno
you
conocer estas
again.
iniciativas
It is
prometedoras
great to know
que
about these promising projects and
muestran que es
initiatives,
factible y
which are very encouraging, and they show that
muy
it's
poderoso
desirable and
transformar
possible and very powerful in transforming
la
and to
acción
be
social
able to join the action of women in the protection of natural resources and at the same time to be able to make progress in this economic progress. Another question that we are getting from our participants, Hortencia, they mentioned that many times indigenous women live in violent surroundings and abuse. What could be adopted in matters of overcoming these cycles of violence, um, aside from just traditional education? I think that this has to do also with free determination processes, that they can be able to establish. Some call them different names. Some could call it as how I write down my laws in my communities. They are called protocols or community protocols. Others can call them economic statutes. Some in Bolivia call them there. So they carry different names. How I can write under that free determination is that some people even say that these are violent because in some communities we already have these behaviors, for example, of to punishing thefts and punishing violence, and to punish within the center of the plaza the people that make some misdemeanors. So I think it's important that we women also become organized to have these autonomic statutes where they can write down and say that people will be punished or kicked out of the community, where women can define that internal policy. And that's called free determination. In some places, as Bolivia, for example, there are autonomic or autonomy statutes after leaving and going through an approval process to see if they have been approved. And they say, these men will be kicked out of the communities, etc. And the other thing is the partnerships, because moving out of the circles of violence is not easy. It's not easy first to realize that you are a victim of violence. Why? Because in this patriarchal system where you actually think that living in that way is actually natural, until someday another woman comes and says, no, the way you're living, when your husband comes and rapes you and hits you and beats you, that's not normal. And that's how they realize that. So they will realize suddenly that the way they're living is not normal. But you can't realize that on your own. You will find that out with other communities, other women, other women. Women help heal other women, and only through the experience many times, only through that push and that strength. And on the other side, we need to have legal frameworks. So it's actually three things. One, so the laws that we can, or standards that we can accomplish. So the legal framework of every country is very important, because many times I'm going to say, why am I going to complain? Because they'll do nothing about it, because many legal policies are very slow. But you need to complain. It's necessary to do that. So in some places it works well, in others not so much. And third, to find support in other women. So solidarity is fundamental. I think that many women, I don't think that there's a woman that can say that she hasn't gone through an episode of violence, because in these patriarchal societies, all women have gone through some sort of violence. For example, when they go to, some sort of transport, so going to our workplaces. So in different environments, we live through these violent situations every day. Some of us already recognize them, but other women don't recognize them yet and think that that's normal. So there's a lot of work also to do there. So in that recognition of advancing in this, to identify the different types of violence that there are. Thank you, Hortencia. Now we would like for you to tell us what has been your experience in the different educational and literacy programs for women who are heads of household. What positive impact does the education of women have on their autonomy and environmental protection? What a beautiful question, because that's my foundation, that's my identity as a teacher. And the first thing when we went to university is the rural area. First, a teacher, a school that had one only teacher, that means it's one teacher in a very far away school with 15 or 10 students. I've had even only two students in some communities. And even if it's only one student, the right to education is fundamental. Even if it's the farthest away community, they first need to have the right to education. After that, my experience also made me be able to work with women in the urban areas, but of the periphery, maybe of the most rural parts of big cities and the most peripheral places, where I had to do literacy studies for many years. So it was women who didn't know how to read or write, and that great joy that I would get when they would tell you to learn reading and writing changed my life, because many times they had to resort and find help from somebody else to find an address, to be able to read a list. Somebody else had to read it for them. And many times they would say, well, I didn't know, even when I was trying to find a street, I wouldn't be able to do it because I wasn't even able to read. So literacy was fundamental in order to change lives. And second, some women not only stuck to literacy, but they leveled up basic studies that we also did through other programs. And some even were able to reach university levels. So those changes are hugely important. First, the right to education needs to be fundamental in rural communities, where even if there's just one student, there must be school. And and second, that women need to have access to that education. Many times, the percentage in Latin America of indigenous women that desert their studies or that leave school are many, and these are examples from my personal experience. I worked for many years where women are always, taking care of their children because they become mothers very young, and sometimes even working at night until we would have to study very late at night, and that still changed their lives, undoubtedly. Many times there were men who wouldn't allow them to go to study, and they would close them down at the house. So they would have to escape to go to study because they felt that that way they could change their lives. And at the same time, they would be able to help their children, their daughters and sons. And many times they would say, I feel so ignorant that I can't help my child in his schoolwork. So they say, now I can give them different tools. And so the right to education is fundamental, but also the right of education with identity. So it's not only those bilingual intercultural studies, but now there need to be laws, there need to be linguistic rights so that our peoples or communities can be able to get educated appropriately. It's important to know all the other things, but we do not need to lose our identity and our cosmo views and worldviews. We also need to, other people need to also learn about those. Thank you again. We have a last question from the participants, and it is related to what you were talking about first, but it's a little bit more specific, to ask us, what is your view, your perspective for Indigenous women to project themselves as empowered women and capable of developing economic activities to move forward, not only within their communities, but also as entrepreneurs? And they tell us that there is a lot of macho chauvinism within their community. So I would like to know how you can address that and how you can break these traditional thinking paradigms. I think that we're already breaking those paradigms. We Indigenous women are already doing that. And that way we can do it and be able to lead important processes and within different areas, not only, things like cosmetics or areas but even large areas like in Argentina, our colleagues are developing the improvement of camelids. So it's their camelids to have a better economy. So this is only women they're trying. So like alpacas and to have a better fiber. So so the Andean, we produce, my family produces quinoa, and it's a superfood, quinoa. So it was recognized in the world because of its, nutritious properties, and it's very very expensive in Europe. You go to a supermarket and it's very expensive. We have a great difficulty there. Those of us who produce quinoa, we sell at a low price, and those that resell, they sell at a very high price. That's the gap that we need to overcome first. We need to find our own buyers, not use these intermediaries who keep most of the profits while we work hard. And just like my parents, or like potatoes, because it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of work. There's a lot of effort, a lot of labor in there, but then sell it, for a miserable price. And then somebody else resells the product at 3 times the price. So that's the first thing we need to do. And here the states need to collaborate. They need to help within these relationships and links between seller and buyer without intermediaries. And I think that that is fundamental to stop using these intermediaries, because we are able to form indigenous cooperatives, to make these, collective institutions. It is important within this collectivity to be able to become, to do these direct sales. And on the other hand, it is also important to support these processes through different, and here I call out states and international cooperation. Indigenous women need more support for this economic empowerment, and more so during times of pandemic, where it has been even worse for indigenous women. And we have demonstrated that we have knowledge, that we have the strength, and most importantly, that different relationship that we have with Mother Earth. So international cooperation needs to also support indigenous women. There are many countries where collaborations do not get there anymore because these are developed countries or countries under development, but inequalities are so large, and that means that indigenous communities are very poor because those territories have made them poor. And so today, first, getting to know their rights well, because there are many indigenous communities who do not know their rights, and because they have struggled so much and they have been, dominated environmentally, and they have no resources. So we need to overcome that gap, but we also have to overcome them. And I always insist from free determination of our own decision making, and also with public institutions. And there needs to be a full and effective participation of indigenous communities and especially indigenous women. Hortencia, what a great pleasure to have listened to you today. What a great possibility to have your testimony and experience of a leader, indigenous woman, who tells us how action and protection of environment are so much linked, and also the action of protection and the moving forward in the rights of indigenous communities. It is great to hear these situations of inequalities and the roles that can be adopted from different sectors in order to overcome these vulnerability situations, like you well remind us. They are not natural. They are product of, you know, uh, unfair situations that many times have put lives in danger, like Hortencia has mentioned, where they are there, where the waters and the forests are protected. So it's great also to hear about these great and powerful experiences through which indigenous women have great potential to continue moving forward in their economic empowerment, but also in the urgent need that the other stakeholders, whether the state or cooperation, can provide for this progress forward and for this protection of the indigenous people's rights and indigenous women's rights and the protection of our life and natural spaces. So thank you very much, Hortencia. I don't wanna, I would like to welcome you and invite you again for our next coffee time, which will take place on October 1st. Thank you all very much.